One, two, three. Here we are. Okay. So,
Okay.
hello again. Thank you very much for joining me today. For a start to kick us off, would you mind telling me a little bit about what your role or job title is and what does that mean?
Okay. So my name's Lorna Campbell, and I am currently a Learning Technology Service Manager within Information Services Group at the University of Edinburgh. And my primary role is as manager of the university's Open Educational Resources Service. That is a central service which supports all staff and students to engage with open education practice, and open education resources.
All right, sounds good. And on this topic, now that you mentioned open education, what does open mean to you in that context when thinking about it broadly?
I mean, that's a question that people have been trying to answer for probably about 25 years. So it's like it's very difficult to answer that in one sentence, and it really depends what angle you're coming from. I mean, you can come at it from very much from a copyright centric perspective, which is important. You can come at it from a social justice perspective. Um, I personally think that all these things are important, but I think there has to be an element of equity for there to be true openness.
Mhm. And so, actually, as we think about, say, licensing or about social justice, um, what is their connection to equity and the concept of openness?
Well, it's not, I wouldn't say it's a case of either or. So, licenses are there to protect the creative works of individuals, and also to enable individuals to share their work under terms that they set. Licenses can be very empowering. They can, of course, provide barriers as well. But I think in terms of, I mean, knowledge equity, I think is a really important concept when it comes to openness, which is really about, who are the people who have the power to contribute to the creation and dissemination of knowledge. Who is included and excluded from these conversations. And part of that is about how we control access to information and education and knowledge. And that is where you get the intersection between things like copyright and licensing and equity. And I think it is important to um, be cognizant of the fact that there are both benefits and risks to openness, depending on where you are situated in relation to different power structures.
Hmm. And I guess to also expand a little bit on this, is openness a property of things, or is it something that is open for someone, or is it a type of interaction?
I would say it can be all these things. So it depends if you're the perspective of what you're looking at. If you're looking at an artifact, it can be a property of a thing. If you are looking at society in general, it's something entirely different. So I would say it can be very intersectional.
Hmm. Okay. So I suppose we can shelve this for a bit and we'll come back to it. As we're interested in the topic of AI, another thing I wanted to ask you about is what does artificial intelligence mean to you?
um, that's an interesting question. Well, I think one of the best definitions or explanations I have heard of artificial intelligence, particularly generative artificial intelligence, came from Helen Beetham, who gave the keynote at the Alt Winter Conference last year, where she spoke about AI in education. And she pointed out that the terms generative, artificial, and intelligence are all highly contested individually, and even more so when you put them together. And she argued that artificial intelligence is neither artificial or intelligent, and that a much more appropriate term for it would be synthetic media, which I rather liked.
Synthetic media.
Yeah.
Interesting. And what does that mean?
Well, it's media that has been created by somebody.
Hmm.
So it takes away the sort of the artificial intelligence, and it's not intelligence. These systems are not intelligent in any way, shape or form. They're algorithmic. They're putting data together in ways that they don't really understand, and these algorithms have been created by us, by people, with our own biases and assumptions, and so I think the idea there's a lot of humanizing vocabulary is used to describe these systems. The other really well-known one is hallucinations. Artificial intelligence sometimes hallucinates. Of course, the other way of saying that is that actually it's wrong. So yeah, by introducing this very humanizing language, we're imbuing these uh, synthetic media systems with a humanity that they do not possess.
Hmm. Okay. So I suppose for the rest of the conversation, if we talk about AI, we'll be referring to synthetic media creating systems.
Yeah, I mean, generative AI is the terminology that is used, and I think there's a distinction as well between the sort of the older fields of AI in computing, in parallel computing, etc., and the sort of generative AI systems that we're seeing now built on large language models. And I don't know where you want to situate this conversation. I'm assuming that it's more towards the generative AI end of things.
I'm interested in all of them because it's important to know as we get on to thinking about what OpenAI could mean, what AI are
Mhm.
we referring to in the
Yeah,
first place?
yeah, I think that it's important to be able to make these distinctions. And I'd freely admit I'm not an authority on artificial intelligence. Yeah, I'm not a computer programmer. I couldn't tell you anything about um, perhaps a more sort of traditional field of artificial intelligence. Um, I've kind of like bumped up against generative AI because it's unavoidable at the moment. But I think it is. Um, I think it's important when having these conversations that we know where we are on that scale of things.
Mm. All right. So taking these things together, open education in the sense of education that is supposed to increase equity
Mhm.
in all the different shapes and forms of open, and AI as synthetic media creation. When putting them together, what could open AI in education mean?
Well, there's some people have some quite strong opinions on this. Um, One perspective is that if the aim of open education is to increase the quantity of education resources, then one way to do this is to use generative AI to create more of these education resources. Um, However, I would argue that that fails to take into account that I think that oversimplifies what open education is about, which is about sort of practice and connection and all these things we've been talking about, equity, restorative justice, etc. Um, and I don't think generating content is going to address these issues because these are very human issues. So um, I think there's a lot of tension there.
Aha. So there's the simple kind of open AI, which promotes increased content, but that's not truly open AI. Something that would be open would then also have elements of social justice and promoting collaboration, like you
Mm-hmm,
mentioned.
mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think I mean, the big elephant in the room with any discussion about AI, of course, is the environmental cost of it. And you can argue, is there any way to use these systems ethically when they have such a catastrophic environmental impact?
So ethical is an aspect of it too. But
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
is it, I suppose, is it part of open or something that goes hand in hand with open?
It's absolutely fundamental because there are so many different ethical angles with relation to AI, whether it's the ethics of the algorithmic biases in the data sets, the ethics of the theft of content, that, you know, the content that has been scraped for these large language models without the consent of the individuals who created that content. There's ethics regarding the exploitation of labour, with people who, frequently in the global majority, who are responsible for cleaning the data in the large language models. And there, as I said, there's the environmental impact as well. So there's a whole host of ethical issues around the use of any kind of generative AI. And that's not to say that, we absolutely shouldn't touch on a barge pole. They're out there in the world now, for better or for worse. But I think that any interaction with them has got to be cognizant of these issues. And I think that's particularly important for open education, which, if it does have a commitment to equity and social justice, etc., that it never loses sight of these potential harms and, well, real world harms and impacts.
Hmm. Aha. And so I suppose, much like with open education, when we say open AI, we could be talking about it as a property of the models, but not only. We could be talking about how we use the models and the interaction between people and AI.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And like I say, there are, very real world consequences of, if you look at how these models were created and who is doing that creation and who is, cleaning the data, there are some, quite serious issues there.
Hmm. And I'm thinking, as there are many different aspects of open in this case, can you think of any examples where that you would say were open aspects in the AI space?
I mean, I'm not sure I quite understand what you mean by that.
Hmm. Well, I suppose I'm looking for any examples of AI where it would be open, even if not in all aspects, at least in some.
Um, well, I mean, OpenAI is a name of a company. I would argue that they're open. I don't think they are. Um, I mean, you were at the OER conference yourself. There were lots of examples of people there, presenting papers of, things, projects that were integrating different forms of generative AI um, with assignments. There are lots of examples out there. Um, I can't think of any one particular example at the moment off the top of my head, but some of the more interesting ones that I have heard about have been people who have been using generative AI to ask difficult questions about the creation of knowledge and consent and how knowledge is created and how we consume knowledge. And I think you can actually use generative AI to open up some of these really difficult issues about the ethics of information and education creation. Um,
Right. So it can be, from the ethics aspect of openness, it can be the conversation starter, something
mm,
that allows us to engage with it deeper.
yeah, mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
that's an example of AI being open, I suppose, or
I would
supporting
I would
open.
say that that's a way to use, you could use that to facilitate open education practice, and that, but you're very much approaching it critically. It's, it still doesn't mitigate the ethical issues that we discussed earlier, but it's certainly, it's one way of approaching that.
I see.
Actually, another example I can give you is um, at the Alt Winter Conference that I mentioned earlier. They had a panel of students talking about how they used AI, and that was very interesting because some of the use cases they were putting forward were things like students with English as a second language found it useful to use generative AI to help them to get a start on, say, summarizing articles, that kind of thing, to help them find a route into the kind of academic language in English. Similarly, non-neurotypical students said that they found it sometimes quite useful to be able to use generative AI to help them to process information. There was another example of students who were using ChatGTP and similar systems to ask questions. It's almost like entering into discussion. And they were able to see as the questions they were asking were becoming more and more, or the responses they were getting were becoming more and more nonsensical. And it was a way for them to hone their own sort of critical faculties. So there were some very interesting ways that students were using these systems. But what came across quite strongly was that students appreciate the process of academic writing and learning to do that, and that the craft of academic writing is meaningful to them, and that they do not want to replace that with AI-generated text. So I think, again, there are ways that you can use these systems within education, but again, you still, of course, have all the sort of ethical issues that we discussed earlier.
I see. And that really feeds into the next question on the role of OpenAI. And when I'm talking about OpenAI now, I mean the ideal kind of OpenAI that represents openness in all its aspects. So we're hypothesizing here. What would be the role of such AI in enhancing education?
I think the question is there an ideal? And this is what it's quite interesting when I read the questions. The questions are skewed from a very the perspective that there is an ideal and that there is a positive and that there is a, and I think there might be, there equally might not be. So you could turn that question round and say, well, are there going to, is there an ideal benefit, or does the idealized AI offer us anything that we cannot do ourselves as human beings in human-centered education systems, in human-centered societies?
Yeah, I like that. That's really like asking, does the question even make sense?
Yeah,
Would
it's
OpenAI benefit? I
yeah.
suppose that remains to be seen whether AI would benefit, and then on top of that, OpenAI itself.
Mhm.
Mhm. And I'm wondering if you know of any trends or developments at the moment that are influencing this space. You mentioned that there are people with interests in
Mhm.
defining what openness means. What
Mhm.
did you mean by that?
I'm kind of like, I don't want to go into this in too much detail because I don't want to keep amplifying the same voices that get amplified over and over and over again. And there are people who are very much, I think, regarded or regard themselves as kind of the founding fathers of open education or of AI, and I use the word fathers specifically because they are all men. And I think I'm not sure it serves us to keep amplifying the same voices over and over again. And I think um, there are other voices in this space that I think it can be interesting to listen to. I mean, um, one voice is Timnit Gebru, who was Google's head of ethics and AI. I think was at Google she was with, and she was so I think Timnit Gebru and has been she's written some really interesting pieces about the very real world impact of AI now, rather than I think there can be a tendency to sort of catastrophize that, what will happen in the future if, if we have unfettered AI. And I think if you get very tied up in catastrophizing, it's very easy to ignore real world harms that are happening now. So I think sometimes, as with any current topic, there are always certain voices that are heard more prominently. And I think it's sometimes important to step back and listen to other voices from other people. I'm being very diplomatic here.
All right. And yeah, that really speaks to, I suppose, the principle of equity that you mentioned at the
Yes.
beginning,
Yes. Yeah.
getting equal chance opportunities and participation. Right. And I suppose on the same line of thinking, can you see any challenges in implementing open AI in education as we are moving forward?
Well, again, I mean, it really comes down to, what do we mean by, what does this really mean? What does OpenAI mean? But I think if you want to take a more concrete example, there are issues there are a lot of issues relating to data retention. And the ownership of data that's inherent in the use of these large language models. If you're anything you type into ChatGPT, they will save and they will own and they will reuse, and you have no choice in the matter. But one approach to this is, for example, what Edina have been doing with Elm, where they're using a locked data set for students, so that any interactions students have with the language model will not be recorded. So that prevents data or queries created by students actually being fed back into the language model. That's one. I was going to say one very simple way to do it. I'm sure it's not simple to implement that, but that's one way to deal with the sort of privacy and data security aspects of the ownership of student generated content. Again, still doesn't sidestep the bigger ethical issues, but that's quite a pragmatic approach that is being taken within the university.
Mm. And I like this example because it especially highlights how less sharing of data can lead to something that's more open.
Yeah, and I think it is something that's very important to be aware of in these discussions, is that, I mean, I've been an advocate for open education and open knowledge for 20 or 30 years now, and I believe in that passionately. But at the same time, we have to apply the same critical lens to openness. And like I said, we have to realise that, I think it's Catherine Cronin who said that openness is highly contextual. That's what I mentioned earlier on, that people experience openness very, very differently. And openness is not necessarily a universal good. In fact, it can cause harm. And Creative Commons 2 or 3 years ago actually ran a working group about oh God, I can't remember what it's called now, but it was basically about the risks of openness. And there are many, many examples of this. A very well-known example is the risk of sharing Indigenous knowledge. So, of course, there are groups such as Whose Knowledge have been set up to address the curation and ownership of Indigenous knowledge around the world. Other examples are archives of material created by very marginalised groups, which have suddenly been released under Creative Commons license without their consent, and what the implications of that are. There is a very, very interesting example going on right now, which you may have seen. I think he's a Canadian programmer, has taken a data set released by the British Museum under Creative Commons license, which is basically a data set of their catalogue. And he has put an AI interface over it so you can query the artifacts. And he has promoted this, or he has put this out there as a way to engage the public with the artifacts and with the catalogue. So you can go in and you can choose an artifact, and you can ask it a question like, how did you get here, and tell me about yourself and whatnot. And it's a lovely idea. It is massively, massively problematic, and some of the conversations are just mind-blowingly inappropriate. So, for example, one of the artifacts is a mummy. So you can actually go and you can ask questions of the mummified remains of a human being. And this guy has created this AI interface, and it will happily chat back to you. And it sounds like ChatGTP. This does not sound like an Egyptian woman from 2 millennia ago. There are other examples that are one of the Benin bronzes, which, of course, the ownership of which is highly contested. These are artifacts that were looted by colonial power. Another of the artifacts is one of the moa from Rapa Nui, and these are deeply spiritual artifacts. You can chat away to them. And it's been quite interesting to see the reaction to this. So there's a mailing list called the Museum's Computer Group, and he's disseminated it there, and quite a lot of people say, "Oh, this really interesting project. It's nice to see the way that you've used AI tools on top of this open license data set. And in that respect it is." But you also have people, particularly there's been quite a few museum curators on Twitter, again, frequently women, saying you really need to step back here, because this is deeply inappropriate on many, many levels, because the whole ethics of museum collections and colonialism is hugely contested at the moment, and it just kind of doesn't engage with that. So that's a very current example. That's happening right now this week. So that's a good
It's a really
example of
interesting
you've
one.
got an open license data set. And I should stress that this is not a project that he has done with the British Museum. He has taken the British Museum's data set, which they put out there under open license, so anyone can do it. He's not done anything wrong. Anyone can take that data set. You can do anything you want with it, as long as you don't breach terms of the license. But of course, it raises this question: is this a good, equitable use of open content?
Mm-hmm. And that goes way beyond the license.
Oh, yes. Oh, way beyond the license. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Mm.
And one last question I had was about promoting openness in AI and education. And here I'm thinking about the broad sense of openness. So I suppose promoting ethical and equitable use. Are there any steps that you think are necessary to do so?
I think it's all the things we've been discussing. It's being cognizant of the ethics of these systems and what they really mean, and being aware of the impact that that these AI systems can and are having, environmentally, ethically. And that's not to say don't use them, but I think it's that, if you are going to use them, you approach them with that criticality.
Mhm. I suppose it involves all the elements of thinking, should we use them and why?
Exactly, yeah. It's coming at it critically. I think it would be a bit naive to just sort of say a blanket no. It's just like these things are evil, they're bad, they're wrong, we must never go near them. That they're out there in the world now, and the genie is out of the bottle. But I think we as educators and as human beings have it within our own power to question how we want them to be used, and what kind of level of harm we will tolerate to our planet and to our, fellow human beings. And
Mhm. All right. That's quite a nice note, I suppose, to wrap up on. And thank you very much for sharing your insights and your perspective. Now, as we wrap up, is there anything else that we haven't discussed that you'd like to mention?
I'm not sure. I mean, it's like it's a very fast moving field. It's changing very rapidly. Um, I think it is going to be very, very interesting to see how this evolves. I think that I think that generative AI will undoubtedly have an impact on the open education space. I think some open educators will embrace it with open arms. I think particularly um, in areas where open education is very focused on the creation of content, so perhaps such as open textbooks, rather than perhaps more focused on open education practice. Um, uh, I do think that we do still need to remain focused on the ethical issues about it, but I think we've got to be very pragmatic how we approach this as well.
Hmm. In that case, let's keep the conversations going and see where it goes. Thank you very much once again. I'll
Okay,
stop the recording here.
okay, no problem.